I'm Negley Harte, and it's the 16th of March 2001, and I'm here at Hadlow Castle in Kent with Dr Joan Thirsk. Joan, you can't have known Eileen Power, I suppose?
No, because she died in 1940 and I was still at school, so I had absolutely no chance of meeting her.
Did you ever meet Lipson?
No, never.
But the one of the founding fathers of the society who you knew well and knew best was, of course, R.H. Tawney. How did you first come into the orbit of Tawney?
Because I was given a research scholarship after I finished my history degree, and that was in 1945. And I had the chance to go to Tawney as a supervisor. It happened that my husband knew Taylor Milne, who was the secretary of the Institute of Historical Research. So I went to talk to him about the research that I had in mind, and he immediately said, "Oh, you should be supervised by R.H. Tawney," and he took me on. So for 3 years I was supervised by him.
Right. So you had thought of your subject, and it was the subject that took you to Tawney, not Tawney who took you to the subject.
Yes, that's right. The subject wasn't clearly worked out in my mind, but the period was.
Yes. And so you went to LSE to do your PhD, and you started going to Tawney's seminar.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Which you went to for quite a number of years,
Right,
through
yes.
into the 50s.
Yes, that's
What
right.
was that like?
It was a very, I found it a very pleasant and obviously very instructive seminar, gathering together people who were plainly enthusiastic about various different branches of economic history. And the themes that we all took up were very, very different indeed. But it was a wholly relaxed affair, and I met all kinds of research students who have remained in my memory ever since. Not all of them went on, of course, to finish their degrees.
Mm. And presumably around this time you first came into contact with the Economic History Society.
Yes, I find that I joined the society in 1949. I was starting my research then, and I moved on from a year's teaching at LSE, teaching sociology, to teaching economic history at the University of Leicester in the Department of English Local History.
Yes.
And Hoskins, of course, had set up that department. And I think it must have been about 1952 or 53 that the Society held its annual conference at Leicester, and I was the local secretary who did all the correspondence and booking rooms and that kind of thing.
Ah.
And I think, of course I can't remember how many people attended, but I think it was probably something like 40 or 50 people.
That was 1952.
Was it?
The conference
Yes,
was at
right.
Leicester.
Yes, well in that case I had been at Leicester only for 1 year, and I was the one who was responsible for organising it.
Did you go to either of the two conferences before Leicester? The first was at Birmingham in 1950, and the second was at Oxford in 1951. Did you go to either of those?
No, I'm certain I didn't. I have no recollection of those.
And before 1950, there was an annual meeting at LSE, not a residential conference. There'd always been an AGM at LSE in Eileen Power's day, and somehow after the war this grew into a day's conference, which was so successful that it went residential in 1950. Do you remember any of those day conferences at LSE?
It's possible that I did attend, because after all I was living in London, but I have no recollection of those at all.
But about 40 people, you think, came to Leicester in 1952.
Yes, I remember distinctly being quite worried about one person who hadn't turned up by the time dinner was about to begin on the first evening, and I actually got up from my meal to go out and look for him in case he had arrived and was wandering around. So that gives you an idea of how personal your attention could be in those days when you were dealing with small numbers.
And all these people you would have known, some of them well and some less well, but they would all have been known to you.
Yes, I think more or less. But remember that I was a young research beginner, and quite a few of these people were economic historians who had already been teaching before the war.
Yes.
Or rather during the war. And so that I was really rather a junior person among all these older people.
Tawney was, of course, the president of the society. What was he like as president?
I haven't really a very clear memory of him as a president, but again, my impression always was of a rather relaxed character and a very benign one. And he was certainly a benevolent supervisor who just gently led me along, but gave me the utmost freedom to direct my research wherever I wanted. And it was a freedom that I thoroughly enjoyed. I think that I wanted to make my own choices. And I had the feeling, although it was nowhere expressed in any specific way, that he had a sympathetic attitude to women historians because he had had Eileen Power as a colleague in the past.
The editor of the review at the time was Poston, and presumably at some stage around this time you came across Poston, who I imagine was a very active figure in the field at the time.
My only contact with him, I think, was in going to a seminar, giving a paper at one of his seminars in Cambridge. I didn't really have any other close connection with him. I only saw him and heard about him as a very lively scholar who collected some enthusiastic students around him, but of course he was a medievalist and I was an early modernist, so that I didn't have occasion to have a lot to do with him. He was always very pleasant in dealing with me, and I think he approved of the research that I was doing, but I had no real reason to discuss anything with him.
One of the leading early modernists who was around at the time was, of course, Jack Fisher, who you presumably came across at LSE, and he must have gone to Tawney's seminar at the time. I'm not aware that Jack had very much interest in things agrarian. He did, of course, write about food supply in London, but he was very London and exports, wasn't he, in his interests, and therefore not really overlapping with you.
He didn't overlap with me. I don't believe that he ever attended Tawney's seminar. It wasn't the kind of seminar which was attended by teachers of economic history. They were all research students. The one economic historian at LSE whom I did know was A.V. Judges, because he was the one who gave lectures which I attended when I was an undergraduate, because I had chosen to study early modern economic history as a special subject. I was actually at Westfield College, I wasn't at LSE, and so I used to go down to LSE for lectures, and it was A.V. Judges who gave them.
On Tudor economic history?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Presumably in succession to Eileen Power. Had she taught this before the war?
I knew nothing about that. But you see, I was there as an undergraduate at Westfield from 1945 to 47.
Yes.
And things were just picking up again after the
I think Jack Fisher spent a lot of time teaching what used to be called colonial history. By the 60s that came to be called comparative economic development. But Jack, I think, taught colonial history because, of course, he'd been in Africa in the war and was very interested in Africa and Asia. Perhaps acquiring that from Tawney and Power somehow, they both of whom had an interest in China.
That's interesting, but certainly I have no recollection of meeting Jack Fisher until later in the 1960s, and then of course I was involved in writing an essay for the Festschrift for Tawney.
Oh yes.
And then I was aware of Jack Fisher because he was supposed to be editing it for publication.
Yes.
And he was very, very dilatory about it.
Yes.
And when
Jack wasn't really known for his efficiency.
Certainly not. And when we held a celebration to give it to Tawney, we didn't have a volume, of course. And I suppose some apologies were uttered because it wasn't yet ready. I don't think it was even at the printer at that stage. And I offered to drive Tawney back to Mecklenburg Square, and Jack Fisher came with us. And I always remember, as we got out of the car, I heard Jack Fisher utter an apology to Tawney for the fact that the volume was not yet published.
Very good, yes. When you joined the Society in '49, of course now in retrospect we can look at the graph of membership of the Society, and we know that it was ever onward and upwards from '46 up to the mid or late '70s. Were you expecting that sort of growth in this field when you first joined it in the late '40s?
Well, let me go back a little bit, because I was introduced to economic history in 1937 when I was at school, and I was taught economic history by a grey-haired lady who was then nearing retirement and who must have been one of the early students of the subject at LSE. And I found it a very exciting subject. Of course, the parliamentary papers were what we were fed on, those parliamentary reports on child labour and factory labour and so on. So it was then that my first interest was aroused. And I think that life during the war somehow increased interest generally in economic and social history. And after all, G.M. Trevelyan's social history appeared in that period, didn't it, and aroused a great deal of interest among the general public. So when I chose to specialise in economic history, I was at Westfield, and Mrs. Mary Stocks was the person who taught the subject there. She again was one of the old LSE students from the early part of the century. So really I was introduced to the subject by this whole combination of factors, which made it seem to me perfectly natural that people should continue to be interested in the subject right through the 1940s, when we were all returning from the war. I mean, I had served in the war, and most of my fellow students had.
Yes. But as the subject grew in the 50s and 60s, did it grow in the sort of ways that you found sympathetic, was this a development of the sort of original interest that you developed in, I suppose, how people got their livelihoods out of the soil? Or did you detect the subject in this period of growth taking on some less attractive features, perhaps?
Well, most certainly, when I started research, the whole subject was wide open to anybody who wanted to study a subject from any viewpoint. And I had no sense of any hierarchy of subjects in the field. But of course, gradually the range of the subject tended to narrow. It was sort of driven into narrower channels by the rise of the economists, who were, throughout the 1920s and 30s, were gradually honing their tools, and they came to prominence, I suppose, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the subject was still attracting a great many people, but you had the sense that a hierarchy of methodology was developing, and it certainly was alien to me to go first to the counting exercises that were being used by many economists rather than other approaches. I mean, I really did believe in, and still do believe in, a great diversity of approaches to the subject, and I personally enjoy the study of a period, starting from the way in which contemporaries looked at it, and getting my cues and getting my ideas from listening to contemporaries who were living at the time, because I think they had a much broader view of the scene than we shall ever get. But it was the economists who really came to dominate the scene. And by the time the economic history departments began to be set up independently of other departments, and a whole host of chairs in economic history were being created, I realized then that my methods were not really in vogue any longer. I used to laugh to myself because there was one adjective which would occur again and again in testimonials for the applicants of whom the economists approved, and that adjective was rigorous. If you were rigorous, then you really did have a chance of getting appointed to a chair. But if you were not rigorous, then you were sloppy, and you relied on anecdotal evidence, and anecdotal evidence was just the abyss. Personally, I think that the most original insights come from anecdotes, piling anecdotes one on another. And it's been very interesting to me to read a book by an eminent pathologist who actually tells me that the same problem has arisen in medical research, that the anecdotalists are despised, whereas he says, in fact, medical research moves forward on the basis of anecdotes in the first instance.
How interesting. You talk about all this spread of chairs of economic history, which characterized the 50s a bit, but certainly the 60s and the early 70s. And the setting up of a chair usually meant the setting up of a separate department, usually at arm's length from both history and economics. Now, do you think that was a useful or sensible development?
No, I don't think it was a fruitful development. I think it isolated the economic historians from other historians. It also isolated them, of course, from economists, but in my experience, economists are not really listening to what economic historians say, so maybe that was no great loss, but it certainly has been a great loss in separating the economic historians from the historians. And I welcome the fact that these departments have closed and the economic historians have rejoined the historians. I can't believe that it won't benefit the subject in uniting them in discussions again with each other.
I think there's a lot in that. Would you agree with my thesis that going with the decline of economic history, evident in membership or any statistical index since the late 70s, going with this, of course, has been a sort of intellectual victory over the historians, because I don't think since the 1970s there has been an old-fashioned, narrowly political and diplomatic and perhaps ecclesiastical history, in the sense that I suppose there much more obviously was in 1926 at the time of the foundation. And so there was a sense of a new field of history that needed to be opened up. But by the 70s and 80s, there wasn't that sort of old-fashioned historians with narrow interests. They had all acquired economic and social and indeed cultural interests. And so there's a sense in which economic history has been an intellectual success, and its intellectual success left it in an awkward position institutionally. Do you think there's anything in that? I think that's my thesis.
I think myself that history requires one to look at all facets of human activity, if possible, at one and the same time. And of course we aren't able to do that. We tend to concentrate in one direction rather than another. But the more readily we come together to discuss the interdependence of all aspects of life, the more persuasive, I think, is the history that we write. So I'm not inclined to talk about victories and failures of one branch rather than another. I'm tending to rejoice in the fact that all these different aspects are coming together rather slowly, but I do see, in a way, in the growth of cultural history, a tendency to embrace all aspects of human activity in one story, and that, to me, would be an advance.
Whereas our relationships with economics have got really even weaker, because they've got narrower and narrower in their interests, and it's very hard now to find an economist with serious historical interests. And economic historians have, in a way, become less economic, perhaps, than they were. Is that right, do you think?
Well, I rather hope so, because I think that historians come to their subject because they are interested in human beings. And they aren't so much interested in abstract concepts. And they plainly have to talk in abstract terms sometimes, but they should never lose sight of the fact that they are dealing with human beings who operate on many different levels and operate from many different motives at one and the same time. So as we under the influence of the economists, lost touch with human beings and human choices, and sometimes irrational human choices. We were moving away from the central interests of the people who do want to study history, and that is the way in which I would explain the decline in the membership of the Economic History Society.
I suppose the coming of something that proudly proclaimed itself in the 1960s as the new economic history didn't leave you breathless with enthusiasm.
No, I was very alarmed at the time, extremely alarmed, not least because it was introduced to us as though it were going to be a miraculous solution to all problems. I can well remember one seminar in All Souls at Oxford, when a paper was given to us which really seemed to promise a wholly new world as a result of a computerized study of the past. And I had been brought up on a diet, as I've said, to which Storney was most sympathetic. And I've remained with those prejudices ever since. I was amused to read his introduction to the 1937 edition of Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, in which he referred in passing to the use of the word capitalism and said abstractions like that fall like a thud on English ears.
Yes. The elaborate, well, there were some advantages to the new economic history or econometric history. There was a precision. We're not going to use rigorousness as an insult, are we? It was always pretty clear what they were talking about. There was a sort of clarity. But of course, if everything had to be answered in quantitative terms, it was terribly narrowing, because there's a lot of aspects of life where it doesn't seem easily possible to get at things in that way. And secondly, of course, it focuses attention really on only the late 19th century and after, in order to have enough numbers to crunch. So there's a narrowing, I imagine, that you feel about it.
Yes, and because one felt that one had to be crunching numbers to be a respectable historian, people were tempted to do this with subjects in the early modern period. And they could only do it by simplifying their problems, or going to classes of documents which seemed to offer the chance to make elaborate calculations. And in that way they closed their eyes to many important aspects of their problems they just did not want to see. And that, I think, has been a tragedy. And I think in the future we shall probably gasp at the way some subjects were simplified because we closed our eyes to problems which we knew we couldn't illuminate by counting heads.
But while economic history, perhaps in the last quarter of the last century, was becoming narrower, maybe more rigorous, at the same time there was a social history, or an economic and social history, that was flourishing and very much in the tradition that you've just been praising, I would say. I mean, in the last quarter of the last century saw so many admirable works, did it not? Linking the local and the particular, and I mean there was quite a flowering of local history, of social history, of what came to be called cultural history, all of which I imagine you are enthusiastic about.
Yes, indeed. I think it actually demonstrated that the trends in economic history were alien to a lot of people, and they sought their satisfactions in other branches of history, and that's how social history flowered, and local history became a very satisfying subject, because you were there able to at least attempt to see people in the round, and you weren't just picking on certain aspects of their lives and dissecting those and leaving the rest out of account. And I remember very clearly somebody coming to see me in Oxford, who was finding it difficult to recruit students to study economic history, and explaining to me how he was intending to lure the social historians into his net. And I realised then that social history was in danger of being quantified in the way that economic history had gone for quantification. But I don't think it has actually happened. I don't think that attempt was successful.
I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the booklet that's been issued for the Glasgow conference. I only got mine the other day. Perhaps you haven't got yours yet, with the young researchers paper in it, including a piece from Giorgio. But if you haven't read it, I can't ask you about it. But I was going to say, if you look at the range of things, Giorgio's actually looked at it more carefully than I have, and you said some of them were terrible. But some of them are very good. There's a very interesting range of, these are, we have to say new researchers, don't we, not young researchers, because they're not all young. But a lot of them are young, and it does show a very, I mean, there's quite a number of them, and it's a thick little booklet. And they cover quite a range of, there are the quantifying narrow ones that deal with very recent periods, but there are all sorts of interesting papers on the sort of things that would interest you. But I've only flicked through it, and if you haven't seen it, I can't.
Well, I can say that I was at the Bristol conference last year, and I did read the researchers, young researchers' papers then, and I was rather excited by some of them. I felt that a new age was dawning. I hope I'm right. What you say suggests that I may be. I think that the change in the compass of economic history will probably be quite slow to take effect. But I do think that in the end people rebel against the attempt to turn the study of history into the study of numbers and ciphers, and it is really proving what I felt right at the very beginning, that we want to learn a little bit more about people.
Well, I think there is a terrific range and variety of things. And of course, this conference in Glasgow is going to have over 200 attendances. I think we went up to 250 for the Jubilee conference in Cambridge. So the number of people working in the field and coming to the conference hasn't fallen as rapidly as the membership shows. Unfortunately, it's very hard to do a graph of people attending conferences, which will give us perhaps the sort of inner core. But there's a lot of problems about if people come for a day, or if they stay, or do they stay the whole time, or the Urban History Conference. I talked to Maurice Beresford the other day, and he said, I'm going for the whole orgy. I said, Maurice, what do you mean? Oh, he said, I'm going to Urban, of course, beforehand. I used to do that, and of course I used to go on to the Agricultural History Conference, but I feel that I'm too old to cope with a whole week of conferences. Are you going to all three of them?
No, I'm too old to cope with more than one conference at a time. What I do still reflect is the very small number of women who are involved in economic history, and that has been very, very noticeable to me, and it continues to be noticeable, because of course when the subject started at the beginning of this century, women were very prominent, and I dare say there were as many women as men.
Well, I have counted the original membership list, and Maxine Berg has made a certain amount about that. When the society was founded, the women were fully 20%. And when the Women's Committee was founded of the Economic History Society in the late 80s, they had sunk to 10%. I don't know if you think that says something about the subject.
Well, it is a large issue, and all I suppose I would say was that it was very noticeable to me when the great expansion in the subject was taking place in the 1960s and early 1970s. Not a single woman historian was appointed to any of the chairs. And I never even heard in the casual discussions any suggestion that a woman might be appointed. I do myself, in my old age, I realise that women look at the subject differently from men. I'm absolutely convinced nowadays of that. And that is part of the problem in getting any sort of equality in a society between the men and the women. I think their viewpoints are different. But I also notice that the women tackle subjects which at first are passed over by the men, and then the menfolk do in the end come around.
Once it's become established, it becomes more masculine.
The menfolk come around to seeing the significance of these subjects and realise that they are worth studying, and then of course they do tend rather to take them over. But this is the result of experience over a very long period, and I wouldn't have seen these things clearly when I was younger. I wouldn't have seen them at all, but I'm very conscious of them now.
Well, what sort of things do you have in mind that you think the feminine mind approaches more readily or more easily than the masculine?
In the late 19th century, a woman historian wrote a book about food, for example. Another one wrote about clothing. Now those subjects were absolutely despised for decades. And now we are seeing a very considerable interest in both subjects, aren't we? When I studied rural industries, now that was something new. That was taken up very intensely subsequently by male historians and carried in a different direction from the way in which I would have carried it. I felt that it was a subject, it ceased to be a subject to which I could contribute anything because it had been narrowed in its framework. But when I started to study consumption, the consumer society, now that again was not a subject that was of any interest at the time to economic historians. And actually Oxford University Press did not want to publish my Ford lectures because one of the readers of the book actually said to them, no one will want to read a book about starch, vinegar and pins. Well, we now see an enormous literature about the consumer society, don't
Absolutely,
we?
yes. Yes.
So along the way I've learned quite a few things about fashions in subjects and how they change.
When the Women's Committee of the Society was founded, there were a few of us, me in particular, who were strongly against it. I forget if you were at the council meeting where it was approved, which was at Norwich, and if you remember, we couldn't agree, and it was agreed that the council would reassemble when the bar closed at midnight. And we had this extraordinary meeting at which I remember making a speech about apartheid, which I said I would not welcome. But of course it was carried by a majority of the council that they would have a women's committee. And of course the fact is they have been enormously successful. They haven't been at all divisive in the way that I feared that they would. And they've always had very jolly parties and a very jolly conference. And it was partly because, I have to say I don't know how deliberately, but it was partly because they focused really on consumption. And that sort of approach rather than the old focus on production. I think consumption was quite a theme, and they've done a lot of social history and cultural history, and very interesting conferences. I remember you were at the one, I forget if it was last year or the year before, but you were certainly at one of their November conferences, either last November or the one before. Mm-hmm. And those have been enormously successful, and of course attended by men too, perhaps younger men.
I think it's quite important, really, in paving the way forward, to recognise that the men and the women look at the subject differently. I think it's actually a constructive way of advancing, because it does, I think women are already conscious of the fact that they look at the world differently from men, but I don't think that men have really come around to admitting this, and I do see it as a positive step forward if it is generally recognised that we see the world differently, and so both of us, both men and women, can contribute a great deal equally to advances in the subject.
Giorgio, I don't know if you think there's anything you would like to ask or suggest some new field.
Not really.
Is there anything you would like, while Giorgio's thinking, is there anything you would like me to ask you about? We've touched upon most of the things that I wanted to raise. Further reflections on the decline of the subject, or?
No, because I think you've given me a chance to talk about the future in the way that I wanted to talk about it. I mean, in a very positive way. And
you're not unhappy about the future?
No, I'm not. As you say, the actual existence of a women's committee seems to me to pave the way for women to play a more positive role in shaping the policy of the society. And I do now see quite definite efforts being made in history departments to increase the number of women. It is recognised as a defect that departments have no, or just one, woman teacher in the department. And I am rather hoping that more women will perceive these differences. It's not something that I would have seen when I was young, and I think that a great many of them don't recognise the differences between the men and women. And it's a pity that you have to wait until you're in your late 70s to see this clearly in the way that I do. But I think that as we all write more about the subject, the women themselves may see it much more clearly. I mean, I'm hoping that I might have time to write a book about the history of women, because I was deeply offended by the book on the history men that was written some decades ago.
Kenyon.
Kenyon, yes, yes. And
And it's short on women, is it? History men?
oh yes, oh yes. It purports to tell the story of the writing of history from the beginning or from the 17th century, but it has only the very briefest references to one or two women in the 19th century. And I came to realize how many, many women there were in the 19th century writing history, so that I actually read them very intently these days, and I build up a collection of works that are written by women, and I actually go to them with quite considerable excitement, positively expecting that they will have a different viewpoint. Every one of them I'm expecting. They don't always show the same degree of originality, but they often do have an original viewpoint, which proves my argument that the women do come to look at things from different angles. I did write one article on this, and I think there's a lot more to uncover.
You have an introduction to that book by Mary Pryor, where you make some of these points.
Yes, but I wrote a much more deliberate study of the history women.
I haven't read that, Joan. Where is that?
No. Well, it's not a very well-known book. It was published by the Queen's University in Belfast. And it is a shame, I feel, that it isn't better known. I have distributed it around, but I feel reluctant to thrust it at all the men folk who might benefit from reading it.
I should dig that out. I'm interested in that.
Because it does really state my position very clearly indeed.
I must find it. I quite see your point, of course, but my years first at LSE and then at UCL, I've always moved in such advanced and liberal circles that has never struck me as powerful as it might everywhere else, and perhaps in Oxford. But when I was a student, I had three enormously influential women teachers who were certainly influential, very influential for me.
Who were they?
Olive Coleman, Nora Carris-Wilson, and Charlotte Erickson.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
All of them powerful people in their different ways. Olive was the first teacher who actually influenced me, made me realise that we didn't just have to learn history, we had to do it. And of course I went to Nora Carris-Wilson's lectures and got to know. But there was a woman playing quite an important role in the subject in the 50s. She became, of course, president of the society, and wasn't she the first chairman of the publications committee?
Yes, she was.
With those essays in economic history, and she was I remember, were you present at the conference on the new draperies, involving the new draperies in some way at Norwich, when she pointed out that Kerridge was wrong about something, and Kerridge told her that she was simply wrong, and she tossed her hair and she said, I have done it, but they were talking at some point about dyeing, and she said, I have done it myself in my own kitchen sink.
That's so.
I don't think she ever did anything else in her kitchen sink. She was a lady who was used to having servants. But she had practiced dyeing in her kitchen sink, which I suppose would make a point. I don't know how many men. It's less likely that men would do that.
That's right.
I suppose you would say.
Yes, I think that the women do bring a very practical attitude towards lots of problems. I certainly do. And I don't think my colleagues realise just what a practical person I am. She was she was a very friendly character as regards me, because of course she was a Westfield student. But I didn't feel she was a very homely person. I never got on very close terms with her, although I realised that she felt warmly towards me, because I was a Westfield person. And
She was very
also-
keen on Westfield, of course,
Yeah.
and she eventually became chairman of the. She was chairman of the governors
Yes.
at the time of her. She
Yeah.
died on the way to a governors' meeting
Did you?
at
Yeah.
Westfield. She thought she was
Yeah.
late, and she was scurrying around,
Really?
and she collapsed with a heart attack.
Yes. Because she, for me, was a very distinguished scholar whom I admired really rather from a distance. But of course she was the only woman on the Economic History Council after the war, and then when I became a member of council in 1954 there were two of us, and then when she died I was the only one for years and years and years.
She, of course, didn't have the practicality of having to run a household or bring up children. And she did always, of course, have a housekeeper. And her
Yes.
meals were served in a wonderfully old-fashioned way. In fact, I don't know I've ever known anybody else who had a housekeeper.
No, I felt that she was, her life experience was very different from mine.
Yeah.
Certainly.
She was enormously kind to me, very well disposed to me. And I remember her
Yeah.
face lighting up when she used to meet my children. We used to sometimes see her at Notting Hill Gate, and she used to bend down and talk to them in their wheelchair. Very keen on children, and very kind to me. But of course, she wasn't liked by those who knew her well.
No. Well, I think that she didn't. She wasn't really a very warm person. I always was impressed by the fact that she lectured without notes.
Did she lecture without notes? She had masses of information.
Yeah.
Where there no notes. My impression of her lecturing, it can't possibly be right, is it that she wore a hat? Is it possible? I went to her lectures in, I think, 1963-64. Is it possible she wore a hat with feathers in it? Am I making that
She
up?
certainly did wear a hat with feathers in it.
I think she did. At
Yeah.
the conferences. I wonder if she lectured. And it was full of masses of information about dyestuffs from Brazil, and of course sometimes Tony Bridbury used to lecture, and he used to slouch in with his hands in his pockets. And he'd read some third programme research that showed that no one could pay attention to anything for more than 20 minutes. And so he used to lecture for 20 minutes in a sort of offhand, I came to realise, very clever way. But of course he didn't give us any information at all. It was quite different to
No,
Laura.
she used to lecture to us, because I went to LSE for lectures by her as well as AV judges. She used to lecture to us without notes. But I always remember one day when some discussion took place subsequently on the same occasion about a date, and we were all uncertain about what it was, and she suddenly reached for some notes underneath a blotting pad and brought them out, and she had got her dates and everything there.
Okay,
And it was quite a shock to realise that there were some notes somewhere, but she didn't want you to see them.
I remember Arthur John once, he did lecture from notes, and I remember him saying on one occasion that he was halfway through a lecture when he suddenly realised that it was the lecture that he'd given the previous week. And he claimed that none of the students had noticed. So he was able halfway through to sort of work around to what he was going to talk about. And he told this story like how proud he was he'd been able to do this, because I couldn't but think that it did reveal certain things about the expectations of the students.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would not entirely believe that the students hadn't noticed.
No.
I would think that they were too polite to say something, and that seems to me a much more plausible explanation of what happened. I don't think students were stupid then or now.
Now, Joan, is there anything else you would like me to ask you or to say? Because I think the theme about women, which you raised, was the last theme I was going to bring up.
Yes. I think
Georgia,
you picked up this question about the practical side of women, and it does strike me over and over again when I come to consider historical problems that I'm always thinking about the practicalities involved in agricultural operations, and now I'm working on the history of food, the practicalities of cooking and so on. And I realise that I'm constantly looking for all the circumstantial problems that are created by any change in activities,
Yes.
human activities. But I'm sure there are lots of men who look at things in that way, but it is something that is crucial for me in understanding things. I am an active, busy cook, and I've made my own bread for 45 years, always. I never go and buy bread from the baker. And at the moment, when I look at what I'm going to write about the history of food in the early modern period, I'm benefiting greatly from reading contemporary instructions about bread making from the experience that I had myself. And it always makes me feel how inadequate we are as historians very often in judging the past, because we have not actually taken part in the practical efforts that other people have been involved in.
Entirely see that. Giorgio, did you want to ask something?
I really like cooking, but my question is slightly...
He's a very good cook himself.
What do you think about the relationship between a British economic history and a European economic history, or perhaps even better, a North American economic history? We know that the new economic history came from the States. And do you think this was a kind of bad influence?
Well, I haven't read too much of the new economic history coming from the States, because I'm out of sympathy with it. I find myself much more in sympathy with the work of European economic historians. Although I haven't kept up with it as well as I used to in the past, I have always regretted the rather insular viewpoint of English historians. I feel that they have lost touch with European historians, and it's been a very great loss. When you look at the work that was done by Tawney, for example, in the 1910s, he was a fluent reader of German and French, and it's plain throughout his work that these foreign historians influence his thinking. And when I was much more involved with editing and writing agricultural history from the 1950s onwards, I was in touch with French and German and Italian historians. I mean, Mauro Ambrosoli is one of my very great friends and continues to remain a friend who is constantly illuminating my thinking by his own work on Italian and European agricultural history. So I regret very much the loss of these contacts, which is very plain to me in the field of agricultural history. I'm not really in a position to talk about what has happened to English contacts with historians of industrial history or commercial history.
I think the connections were rather stronger in the days when the subject was growing and trying to establish itself and needed allies. And there comes a time when it's established and is big enough not to bother with foreigners.
And also because the English historians don't read these languages anymore.
Still.
They just wait for the foreigners to come along and read English, don't they? And there's obviously great difficulty in persuading young people now to learn foreign languages, so the situation is not going to be remedied, is it?
There's a very great deal in the work of the Annales School in particular that is very much in parallel with your own work. I imagine that's you're much more sympathetic to that source of foreign influence than the North American econometric.
Yes, although I don't feel that I was greatly influenced by Annales.
You came to the same sort of conclusions by different
At the
routes.
same time, yes, and I think that the world around us was driving us all in that direction in the 1950s, and so we weren't influencing each other so much as being persuaded by the events around us to go in that direction. Yes.
The last thing, what would you say to a new or young researcher starting in economic history now?
Well, I would tell them to look at the subjects that they themselves were interested in, and not care about the background or the support that they were likely to get, but just go steadily on pursuing their own interests, because they could find themselves very well paving a new path. And that's really where great satisfaction lies, doesn't it? You can't tell whether others are going to follow behind and endorse your choice of subjects. I mean, you may end up in a blind alley. But on the other hand, my own experience has been that others have followed and picked up subjects that I have embarked on and broadened them out and really introduced a new dimension to
A bridle path becomes a
a
turnpike.
main highway, doesn't it? Yes, yes.
Very good, Joan. Thank you very much.